Well, good morning. You guys have been doing great on your reading. Whether or not you feel like you've been doing great on your reading. But just out of curiosity, show of thumbs up. You have been doing all the reading, thumbs down, haven't been doing any of the reading, somewhere in the middle. This is where it gets a little bit trickier with the book of Leviticus. I think this is when our eyes tend to glaze over, where it's kind of like visiting a foreign country and sitting around the table with people who are just talking a different language than you, and like you really want to participate and you want to be involved, but at the end of the day, it's like you just don't really understand what they're saying and what they're talking about, and then you just start looking around at the decorations on the wall, and next thing you know, you're not reading Leviticus anymore. So maybe that's been your experience, or maybe it hasn't been. But my hope this morning is to make the book of Leviticus compelling for you, and actually convince you that it's a very, very cool book and a very, very important book for our faith as Christians. But first, let me pray for us, and then we'll dive in. Father, thanks for this morning that you've given us. Thank you for the baptisms that are going to take place today after the second service. Thank you for the way you've called people out of darkness and into your marvelous light, and the way you have impressed upon their hearts a desire to proclaim their faith to the church and to make their faith known, and for the church to then affirm their faith in the act of baptism. So God, we are excited to celebrate with 14 brothers and sisters this morning as they declare their faith, and we ask that it would be time of rejoicing and remembering what you have accomplished for us through Jesus on the cross. So God, this morning, as we turn to your word, we ask that you would give us eyes to see and ears to hear. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. I am convinced that Leviticus is an amazing book. I'm going to keep saying that over and over again. It's an amazing book. Sometimes you just have to convince people that it is amazing just by telling them that it is. Word for laborious? I don't know what that word means, but I like it, John. Laborious. Someone have a definition? So I realize that Leviticus is actually really difficult to read. And honestly, this is the first year where I've been reading through it, where I haven't had the uncomfortable experience of not knowing what I'm getting myself into and feeling like I'm having to translate every single sentence from a different culture into my own. But that's taken years of reading Leviticus in this Bible reading plan over and over again, and constantly thinking about it to where I'm a little bit more comfortable with it now, and I'm excited to just read through, and I feel like I have an idea of what's going on. So all that to say, the first time reading through Leviticus, if this is your first time, might not be the best time of your experience reading through Leviticus. So stay with it. Keep doing this reading plan year after year for a few years, and I'm sure it'll get better. Two stories that maybe are going to help, or maybe just be super weird and confusing. But I think about when I find texts that are difficult to understand, I start doing some research, start trying to figure out what is going on in the text. And that's the same thing for all of you. Like when there is a text that's hard, or a passage or a verse, you all have the same tools available to you that I do. They just might not be as detailed. So two things that I think of a lot is I have a drill, but I don't have a compact drill. Jarrell has a compact drill. And when I was hanging my shelves in my office, to just use a drill to put a screw into a stud is very hard. You have to apply a ton of pressure. You get the job done eventually, but it takes way more effort and way more time. But if I were to ever borrow Jarrell's compact drill, it goes right in like 2 seconds. It's just way easier because the tools that he has are a little bit higher quality. Another thing I think of is in middle school, I had a friend come over, and he's like, what do you want to do for the day? I lived out in the country. I was like, I don't know. What do you want to do? He's like, let's go cut down a tree. I was like, okay. So we took a hatchet and we went up into the woods, and we found a tree with about like a 6-inch diameter trunk. And we cut this tree down with a hatchet. It took a very, very long time, but we cut it down. The same tools as someone with a very good axe or maybe a very good saw. It just took us more time to do it. So I'm just trying to think through like what was my experience like doing this 5 years ago versus now. Maybe what is your experience like right now as you're doing it. You have the same tools available. It just might take a little bit longer to get the same results. So my encouragement is to enjoy the process, not just to live for the destination or the end result. that process of learning how to study, you're actually learning something very important, which is how to properly study the Bible. So just keep at it and enjoy. Okay. As you can see, I don't have Leviticus on the board. I have Psalm 15, because the opening line of Psalm 15 is O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill? And this idea is actually a question about the reality that's taking place, that's unfolding in the book of Leviticus. The tent is the same word that's used for the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. The holy hill is the place where ultimately the temple becomes built. But it's also looking back at Eden, which was a little hill, a little mountain where God dwelt with his people. And there is this question all throughout the Old Testament about who is the one who can actually just walk in the tent of God? Who is the one who can dwell on the holy mountain of the Lord? And that question is actually the same question that Leviticus is ultimately getting us to ask. So Leviticus is not an end in and of itself. It's pointing forward to something. And the thing that it points forward to is this question. Who's the one who's going to get to just go into the tent and stay there? Who is the one who's going to get to enter into the holy presence of God and just stay there? And that is the question that the Old Testament points us for. Spoiler alert, it is fulfilled and satisfied in Jesus the Messiah. But with that, let's turn to the book of Leviticus. Leviticus 1. What we're going to do is we're going to read some chunks of it. We're also just going to pull out and look at the macro structure of not only Leviticus, but also of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Because I think when we do that, we begin to see a little bit more of the importance and the excitement of the book of Leviticus. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering or a whole burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord." This word entrance, it's the same Hebrew word that just gets translated as door. So here they are, the entire book of Leviticus, it sets up this structure of sacrifices and offerings, and the sacrifices and offerings take place at the door of the tent. Sacrifices at the door. Can anyone remember the first story we read about where there's sacrifices and a door? Cain. Yeah, all the way back in Genesis Chapter 4, remember this story? Cain and Abel, they come, and maybe these things will sound familiar now that you've read Leviticus. Now, Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain was a worker of the ground, and in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of fruit of the ground. That was something that you're allowed to do in Leviticus. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the entrance, at the door." Where are they trying to enter? Well, Cain and Abel. They're trying to enter back into the garden. Because remember, they got expelled. Adam and Eve got expelled from the garden. They got exiled from the garden. So now here is Cain and Abel, the next generation, and they're making offerings to enter back into the Eden presence of God. Remember, as we read through Exodus, maybe you skimmed the chapters 25 through 31 and also 35 through 40. I understand. But if you paid attention, the details of the tabernacle decorations, it's got pomegranate trees and it's got creatures and everything is made to look like a garden. Why would they decorate the tabernacle like a garden? Because it's a microcosm of the Garden of Eden. It's replaying the Garden of Eden story, and the hope is that maybe one day humanity would be able to re-enter the Eden garden presence of God. So since Genesis chapter 3, with the expulsion of humanity from the garden, the entire Torah and really the whole Old Testament is driving us towards this question: who will enter back in? How will humanity enter back in? Will there ever come a time when humanity can walk with God and God will walk with them and be in each other's presence? That is the biblical narrative. It's about union, being reconciled to God. As sinful humanity and a holy God, how can these two parties be reconciled? That is the gospel narrative. That's the biblical narrative. That's what Leviticus is about as well. So Leviticus has a really beautiful structure to it, which sometimes is hard to miss, hard to see. But it fits into an even larger structure. So I'm going to show you my drawings. So I want to talk to you about the structure of the entire Torah. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This over here is the story of Genesis. If you remember, Genesis starts off with God establishing a really prime piece of real estate, and he puts little Adam and Eve, humanity and life, in that garden space. And then how does the story go? Good or bad? Really, really bad. So they get expelled and they get exiled from the garden, and ultimately it results in chapter 11, which is the Tower of Babel, aka Babylon. So the people are placed in the land, they sin, they're exiled from the land, they find themselves in Babylon. Keep that in mind for what we read after the Torah. But then from there, God calls one person out of Babylon. He calls this guy named Abram, who he renames Abraham. And he makes a promise to Abram that he's going to bring blessing to all the families of the earth. And I can find that promise, that covenant, in what chapters of Genesis? 12, 15, 17. Genesis 12, 15, 17. That is the Abrahamic covenant. So Abraham has Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons, and they find themselves in Egypt, where they have left the land of Canaan that Abraham entered into, and they go into Egypt. But remember how the book of Genesis ends in Genesis 49? There's a blessing for all 12 sons of Israel. Well, let's bounce over to Deuteronomy. We haven't actually read Deuteronomy yet, but Deuteronomy takes place outside of the land, looking into Canaan. So outside of the land, thinking about Canaan. And the book of Deuteronomy, it's a book of speeches of Moses, but the book of Deuteronomy ends with Moses blessing the 12 tribes of Israel. So the first book and the fifth book, they end with hope about the land and with the blessing being given to the 12 tribes from a patriarchal figure. We've read the book of Exodus. We're about to read the book of Numbers after this. If you remember the book of Exodus, it starts off in Egypt, and there's all the plagues, and then they leave through the waters, and then they're at that rock, and they're having bread from heaven, and then it finally results in them getting to Mount Sinai, chapter 19. And then from that point on, they're just at Mount Sinai, and they're getting instructions for the tabernacle. Yeah? Well, when we read the book of Numbers is going to start with them at Mount Sinai, and it's going to be them taking the tabernacle down because they're going to set off on their march. And then the second half of the book is going to be them wandering through the wilderness, and lo and behold, they're going to find themselves at a rock that provides them water. They're going to get some bread from heaven. They're going to fight the Amalekites. A lot of similar stories as what happened in Exodus. So those two books are mirroring each other. And it all centers on the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus is the center of the Torah. So right now, what I'm showing you, this is called a chiasm when there's a structure like this. So it's like A, B, C, B prime, A prime, where the two A's correlate, the two B's correlate, and then you have the center. So it's bringing your attention to the center to emphasize something. And at least in the Torah, the thing that's emphasizing is the book that we all skip, right? Like we read Genesis, maybe we read the first half of Exodus, And then we skip the rest because the rest feels really boring to us. But it is the center of it. So here are the books. And what do you know? The book of Leviticus also has a chiastic structure. So the first section, chapters 1 through 7, you're reading all of these laws about sacrifices and offerings. And what you're reading is law code. Then after that, you're going to read a narrative from chapters 8 through 10. And that's where the priests are anointed, and then Aaron makes the sacrifice, and God's glory comes on the temple or on the tabernacle in fire. And then chapter 10 is Nadab and Abihu getting fired on the job. It's good stuff. It's a good joke. And then after that, you have chapters 11 through 15, which is law again. So it goes back and forth between law, narrative, law, narrative, law, narrative, law. So this structure of going back and forth, it does all center on a narrative. But before there's just a little bit more patterning going on here. I can zoom in on this so that we can see it better. Okay, so the first and the last section, chapters 1 through 7, chapters 23 through 27, they deal with regulations that revolve around the tabernacle worship system. So 1 through 7, it deals with the sacrificial regulations. Chapter 23 through 27 deal with the sacrifice and festival regulations. So what do you do on the Day of Atonement? What do you do during the Feast of Weeks? What do you do during the Feast of Tabernacles, during the Feast of Passover? Those types of things, but it's all revolving around tabernacle worship. And then the narratives, chapters 8 and 10 through 10, and then chapters 21 through 22, they deal specifically with the priests. They are narratives around priestly duties, focusing on the Levitical priests in the tabernacle who are serving in the tabernacle. Chapters 11 through 15 and then chapters 17 through 20 are dealing with daily purity and daily holiness. So basically, what are the personal regulations, aka the non-Levites? What about all the common people? What do they do? So first there is purity, then there is holiness. So I just want to turn it this way again. Going from chapter 1 up to the center, chapter 1 to the center is about entrance into the tabernacle, entrance into God's personal space. But once you've entered, then you are clean, you are pure. Then the call is to be holy as the Lord your God is holy. So one thing that you might notice or pick up on is the sacrifices from here to the center all deal with blood. But from the center to the end, it all deals with water. Because water is just cleansing to maintain holiness, while first they needed to be made pure and to be made holy. But once they are holy, and they should be holy as the Lord their God is holy. So that's something to pay attention to. You'll have blood in the first half of the book, water in the second half of the book. Both water and blood are these liquids of life. If you were to pull the blood out of your body, you would die. Because that is your life. That fluid running through your veins right now is your life. Same thing with water, though. No water, what happens to you? You die. There are two fluids that are symbolic of life itself, representations of life itself. So the blood is its life, Leviticus 17:11, and water is cleansing life to maintain holiness. And the entire book of Leviticus centers on Leviticus 16, which is the Day of Atonement. It's today's reading. The Day of Atonement is the high point of the book of Leviticus. It's the high point of the Torah. It's the theological high point of the entire Old Testament. The Day of Atonement, or as you'll see on your Google Calendar or iPhone calendar, Yom Kippur pops up. It's usually in September. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, would be the day when the high priest would get to enter into the Holy of Holies where God's holy presence dwelt. And if you remember anything about the high priest, because we all read very closely Exodus chapter 28, Remember, he has those stones on his shoulders? And on one stone, he has 6 of the tribes' names engraved on them. 6 of the 12 tribes of Israel. And on the other one, he has the other 6 of the 12 tribes of Israel engraved. And then he wears an ephod with 12 stones. And each stone has engraved on it one of the names of the tribes of Israel on it. He is carrying the name of Israel, the name of the people. He is a representative of the people. So where he goes, the people go. So for the high priest to enter into the holy presence of God is for Israel to enter the holy presence of God. He is a human representative of the nation. So this is a celebratory day for the nation of Israel to be able to gather and for the sacrifices to take place and then for them to watch and see the high priest go in and then to come out and not be killed from the holy presence of God. Because remember what happened to Nadab and Abihu? They took the axe. Actually, they took the fire. But he goes in and he comes out, and this is a celebratory moment because it means we have re-entered the presence of God. The only downfall is it only happens once a year. Remember that book of Hebrews? And it talks over and over again about how Jesus, our faithful high priest, has entered into the holy place and he makes continual intercession for us, and he's made a once and for all sacrifice, never to make one again. It's all about the Day of Atonement. So like if you ever tried to read through the book of Hebrews and you'd be like, I'm really confused, it's probably just because you skip over Leviticus. So all of this is our preparation in about 10 months to read Hebrews, okay? So just remember all of these notes. But there's more structure to this. So this is one way to see the book of it going between law, narrative, back and forth, centering on a narrative, as well as these outer frames that mirror each other, these bookends of tabernacle, sacrifice, and ritual, then priestly duties, then daily purity and holiness laws, and then centering on Day of Atonement. Another way we can see structure, very intentional structuring in the book of Leviticus is there is this reoccurring phrase that Yahweh spoke. Yahweh spoke. And actually there's one other phrase, Yahweh said, and there are actually 37 divine speeches in the book of Leviticus. So it's a book of recorded speeches from God himself to the people. Usually he speaks to Moses, and Moses conveys it to the people. There's one time that God speaks to Aaron, and Aaron conveys it to the people. But these phrases, the 37 speeches of God, there, if you were to divide that in half, right? There's 18 and 18, and the center one, number 19, is Leviticus 16, verse 2. Yahweh said, which is the Hebrew word Amar, and Leviticus 16 is the Day of Atonement. But if you were to ignore the 2 times the word Amar is used and just looked at Yahweh spoke, which is very easy to see in your English translations, there's 35 times that it says Yahweh spoke. 35, 5 times 7, so cycles of 7. And if you were to look at the center time of that phrase, it's Leviticus chapter 16, verse 1, which is the Day of Atonement. So the structure, all of the structure of the book of Leviticus, these multiple layers of structure, they are drawing your attention to the center of the book, which is Leviticus chapter 16, which is today's reading. Which I'm trying to say is don't skip today's reading. Do today's reading, at least the first chapter of it. All right, questions on this? Comments? Concerns?
I thought I
Great. Yeah. Yeah, it really reshapes what you think this Torah narrative is trying to convey to you. Without seeing this large macro structural pattern, you might simply think this is a story about God calling Abraham's family and giving them the promised land, which it is. But what's that land about? What's the significance of the land? Why does the land matter? Well, remember all the way back here where God gave the people a land and it was a place for humanity to dwell with him. Well, that's what the land of Canaan is supposed to be. And it ends up not being that at all. But the only way it's going to become that is with what dwells in the center of Israel, which is God himself in the tabernacle.
I guess another question I always have, or the way that I think about this, is that this is also, and this is very simplistic, this is also in here to show us what we don't have to do. But I don't think that's correct. Because,
I'm not sure I'm tracking.
so we have Jesus, therefore we don't have to follow laws.
Okay.
Because he died for us, and we don't have the Holy Spirit, and we have the faith.
Mm-hmm.
But everything that Jesus is built upon all of these. He embodies everything that's in Leviticus 16:1 and 16.
And all of Leviticus.
And all
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I think I'm tracking. So it's like sometimes we read this and we're like, well, it's nice that we don't have to do any of this anymore.
Right.
But actually, I would be compelled to say the exact opposite. And I'll actually show you not only how Jesus loves the book of Leviticus and alludes to the book of Leviticus, but how Leviticus has bearing on your life right now. Now, it's not a one-to-one correlation. We're not under the old covenant. We're under the new covenant. And these laws have different application for us, different wisdom for us to apply to our life. But there is wisdom underneath all of these laws that we should see. For one quick example, like what does Paul mean in Romans 12:1 when he says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your whole bodies, everything, as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. What type of sacrifice is the whole animal? The whole burnt offering. It's an ascension offering where everything is given over to the Lord. Where did he get that phrase from? Leviticus. So reading through the laws about whole burnt offerings or burnt offerings, which are ascension offerings, they're not covering for sin. It's a blameless representation of you. That in the blameless animal, when you burn it, it becomes smoke. And where does smoke go? Up into the heavens. And it ascends into God's space as a representative of you, a blameless representative. So you live your life as a blameless whole burnt offering. And that is your spiritual worship. He's not saying burn yourself, but he is saying that those laws in Leviticus where you enter God's presence, they apply to you in some way. There is wisdom there. So there is a lot more that we can see than that one. And I'll show you today. Yeah.
So atonement is like a covering.
Not entirely. So the word that's translated atone comes from kapar, which is why it's Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. So kafar just means to cover in a really simple sense. But throughout Leviticus, words have meanings based off of context. To atone could mean to purge and to cleanse. And that's not necessarily due to sin. So it could be a covering for sin. It could just be a cleansing. Think of if, as we were reading through the cleansing laws, there's a different phrase used in Leviticus 11 through 15, which is about being unclean, where the priest will atone for you, but it doesn't say, and you will be forgiven, because there's no sin. So in that example, there's an atonement taking place. And in Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, the tabernacle is being atoned for because the tabernacle has become unclean because of the sins of the people, but not because of the sin of the tabernacle. Does that make sense? So the atonement is cleansing, but not necessarily covering the sin of the tabernacle.
Okay.
So yeah, think of cleansing and covering and paying.
Purging.
Yeah, purging is a great word.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. So as you read through, just think, what's the context going on here? Like what's it doing when it uses this word? What's the result of this atonement? Oh, it's making them clean. Okay, this is atonement of a cleansing taking place. Sometimes it's covering the debt of some sort of harm. Sometimes it's covering for sin. So context matters. Not every word has the same meaning in every single context that you find it. Yes, good question. This is cool, huh? I think it's cool. Okay. Let's read a passage and then see how Jesus also read that passage, yeah? So turn to Leviticus 6. So Leviticus 1 through 7 is all sacrificial regulations. There are 5 types of sacrifices that are talked about, all slightly different in different ways, and there is a progression in how it's laid out, all starting with that ascension offering. But it's all about drawing the individual into the personal presence of God, and it kind of results in being able to have a meal with God at the tent of meeting. So kind of fun, exciting that you get to share a meal with God in front of his house because of a sacrifice. You guys ever think about what communion is? You sharing a meal with God because of a sacrifice? Okay. All right. Anyways, Leviticus chapter 6. In this section. The Lord spoke. Here's one of the divine speeches. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if anyone sins and commits a breach of faith against the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposit or security, or through robbery, or if he has oppressed his neighbor, or has found something lost and lied about it, swearing falsely, in any of all of the things that people do and sin thereby, if he has sinned and has realized his guilt and will restore what he took by robbery or what he got by oppression, or the deposit that was committed to him, or the lost thing that he found, or anything about which he has sworn falsely, he shall restore it in full and shall add a fifth to it and give it to him to whom it belongs on the day he realizes his guilt. Pretty long sentence. Reflections or thoughts after reading that long sentence? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's where we're gonna go. You spoiled the surprise. I'm just kidding. It's okay. No, it's great. Yeah, that's great. Also, this whole thing is categorized as a breach of faith against Yahweh. A breach of faith, a breaking of covenant. Being unfaithful to God. But then everything that's described is you're not nice to the person around you. You're lying to the person around you. You know when David says, I have sinned against the Lord and the Lord alone, when he like clearly sinned against someone else, you're like, oh, I don't know. I mean, it kind of seems like you sinned against Bathsheba and against Bathsheba's husband, yeah. But it's all categorized as a breach of faith against God. So this is why our personal interactions with each other actually matter. To sin against each other is to sin against God himself, because all of us are made in the image of God. That's the logic of the book of James. He says with the same tongue you bless the Lord, and then you turn around and you curse someone made in his image. Like how can you do that? So here's the scenario. You've wronged someone in some way, whether it's, you lent some money to a neighbor, or maybe a neighbor lent money to you, and then a few months go by and you're like, you never lent me any money. A little breach of faith with some money. Or you actually just take something from someone, like I see Lorraine taking off her very nice scarf right now, and maybe I just accidentally swipe it from her because I want that scarf. So you steal something, or maybe you've oppressed your neighbor, or you've found something lost and lied about it. Like after first service, you're walking through and you're like, oh, this is a fantastic coat just sitting on this chair and it looks great on me. And then like 2 weeks go by and it's like, hey, is that my coat? And you're like, no, I got this at the Goodwill. And you make up some fib about it. Somehow You've taken something from someone else. That's the scenario. You've taken something from someone else, and some point comes along, verse 4, where you realize that you're in the wrong. It's like all of a sudden you're convicted, your conscience bears down, you're like, oh shoot, I whether intentionally or not, I did take this, and now I'm realizing and I'm feeling the guilt that this was wrong for me to do. In that situation, what the person should do is to give it back. Give the coat back, give the scarf back, give the money back, and a little bit more. Add 1/5. What's up with that 1/5? Like, why add a fifth to it? Just an offering of kindness?
Has to do with
Well, you're giving it to the person. It's like if I took your scarf and then I give the scarf back to you eventually because I realized I stole it and I was wrong, then I'm going to also give a
sinning
fifth.
against God and God wants.
But verse 5, or anything about which he has sworn falsely, he shall restore it in full and shall add a fifth to it. Why is the compensation required? Mhm. Not necessarily for stealing in the first place, but covers for the period of the wronging. If I took Lorraine's scarf and a few weeks go by, restoring giving the scarf back doesn't make up for that time where she didn't have the scarf. So the compensation is also to be like, it's a covering of that period of damage, not just a restoring of the property. So this is holistic restoration taking place. It's not just a restoring of the property, it's a restoring of the entire scenario where you're also covering for the period of damage. That's the logic behind the 1/5 taking place. And it's given to the person. Like, how do I do 1/5 of a scarf? I don't know. There's no instructions there for that. I'll have to figure that out, what it means to give the 1/5. But in some way, it's not just like, well, here's the scarf back. There's a little bit more to make up for that damaged relationship. So that's step 1. Step 1, give the thing back to the person and make up for it. Verse 6, step 2. And he shall bring to the priest as his compensation, so more compensation. To the priest as his compensation to the Lord, a ram without blemish out of the flock, or its equivalent for a guilt offering. Guilt offering being something that's giving the compensation for the damages. Because remember, this was an offense against the Lord. It was a breach of faith. And the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord, and he shall be forgiven for any of the things that one may do and thereby become guilty. So the logical order of Leviticus chapter 6, verses 1 through 7 is first, be restored with the person you wronged. Step 2, go make a sacrifice at the temple and be restored to God. Yeah? Getting that logic? Okay. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. Whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. So, if you're offering your gift at the altar, if you're down at the temple and you're about to make your sacrifice, and there remember that your brother has something against you, meaning you're in the wrong. They have a strong case against you because you're in the wrong. You remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift at the altar. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. Why does Jesus say first be reconciled, then go offer your gift? Because he read Leviticus and he loved it. And he loved it. And remember, Jesus says, do not think that I've come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Jesus is fulfilling Torah. And the pattern and order of Torah is first You reconcile with the party that you've wronged, and then you offer your gift at the altar for your atonement, not the other way around. So it's a two-step process in Leviticus chapter 6. So it's a two-step process for Jesus. Sometimes because we live 2,000 years later, because the temple hasn't existed since 70 AD, because we live in America, we sometimes just think that Jesus is giving like a nice metaphor of like, hey, you know what? Like at church, I know you really want to raise your hands and worship, but first, you should be on the same page with everyone. And if you've maybe been mean to someone, go say you're sorry first. Then raise your hands and worship. That's not what he's talking about. Like he's talking about the temple system that Leviticus is talking about. Now I think we can make that application, but that's a step away from the original meaning. Does that make sense? So see the original meaning first and then make the application step. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. A ram without blemish out of the flock or its equivalent. The phrase or its equivalent is like, well, if you can't afford that, yeah, you can take the bird. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I don't think so. I think you're reading in context. You're like, oh, I just read chapter 5 where it allows for birds, and it's not gonna ask the writer to repeat that every single time. I mean, that would be demanding a lot, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then when you get to the sections 11 through 15, you also have the same condition made, but it's only made in one of the chapters, so it's not made for every single one, but I think it applies to all of them. It's just a reminder, like, by the way, you can't afford this. Your social economic status is not the thing that keeps you from God's presence. There are many things that can atone, and not even a bird. If you can't afford a bird, just bring some grain, and the grain can become a whole burnt offering for you. Yeah. So God is not demanding a certain type of animal. He's demanding a certain type of heart. Yeah? Someone who's wanting to enter into the presence of God and bringing the sacrifice best they can. Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, they do have at this time they don't have like a currency system set up. They do have valuable metals. They have gold and they have silver. A lot of the gold went into the tabernacle, but far and wide, their economy is established based off of possessions like herds and animals and grain. But right now they're wanderers in the wilderness, so it really is just the animals that they have. But they're all shepherds and nomadic people. But yeah, it does have value. So there is a cost, as it were, for sin that needs to be paid. Yeah. I don't think so. I think something else is going on there. Yeah. Mhm. It was. What's the point of the sacrifice, though? Is it the cost? No, it is reconciliation with God and humanity. That's the point. Very important. Don't miss that. So don't just think, wow, the rams are really expensive. Think, wow, God has established a way for humanity to be reconciled to him, even amidst their sin. Okay, let's go to Leviticus 11. What is going on with all the clean and the unclean? Am I right? What is all this stuff? Jeez Louise, anyone have any thoughts? What's going on? I mean, I've said some stuff in emails, but maybe it's registered, maybe it hasn't. Clean, unclean, thoughts, experiences reading these chapters?
I'm just listening. How much our culture, how I feel about it. And
Okay, yeah. So just the cultural difference. Any other experiences reading the text? Feelings of unsettlement? Yeah. hmm Yeah, like maybe there's an underlying thing of health for all of this, and like they don't know the medical realities yet, but God does, therefore He's protecting them. Yeah, that might be it. And lots of scholars have tried to make correlations between medical conditions throughout all of this. Yeah. 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 Yeah, what is that? I asked that in the email so many times. What's with the evening, you know? Unclean until evening. Unclean until evening. It's a great question. Yeah, I wish I had an answer. I'm just kidding. I have an answer. Yeah, lots of scavenger animals. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. We'll get there. Yeah. Remember Genesis 1? There was evening, there was morning, first day. There was evening, there was morning, second day. Jewish culture today, when does Shabbat start? Friday evening, when the sun sets, because that's when the day begins. So they're unclean until the new day. And then, new day, new creation, they're clean. God's mercies are new every morning, you know? So, and think about this. This is for free, as I tell the college students sometimes. Okay. The Hebrew thought is that day begins at nighttime. What's your first thing that you do at night if you don't have lights? You go to bed. The first thing you do is you rest. Then you live out of your rest and you work out of your rest. We have the idea my day begins when I wake up and I work for my rest at nighttime. Not according to the Bible. You go to sleep and you work out of your rest because God first gifts humanity with rest, not work, in the logical order of Genesis 1 and 2. That was for free. Okay. Okay. It's very important that I say these things clearly because let me tell you a story of how a doofus, in my opinion, has misunderstood Leviticus. This is a story. I don't know who the person was, but I was told this by someone that this girl, she was talking to me. It was a college student, I think 2 years ago, and she was telling me about her experience at youth group, about how when she was at youth group, the youth pastor told her that she was a sinner because she had her period. What a doofus. Doofus. Where did he get that idea? A misunderstanding of Leviticus chapters 11 through 15. Clean and unclean is not a state of sin. Very important. If you were to write something down on the header of chapter 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, unclean does not equal sinful. Unclean does not equal sinful. This is ritual uncleanness, not moral uncleanness. They're very different. If you went to the bathroom and you didn't wash your hands, then you came out and you ate your food, is that cool or is that gross? It's gross. Are you sinning? No. No. Yes. A lowercase doofus, though, in that case. Just unclean. Just unclean. That's the idea. It's just these taboo ideas of clean and unclean. So there are, as far as, I need a new page. So there are two spaces in the Levitical cultus. It's a fancy term for the tabernacle system. You have on one. Are you asking if doofus is a technical term? Oh, I think it's a real word. Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna pull up my notes so that I get these things right because I want to have them right. Okay. Leviticus. Okay. On one hand, you have the sacred, and on the other hand, you have the common. Or sacred being holy, set apart, or common just being everyday things. So sacred exists in God's space, tabernacle space. But there's a division in what is common. In common, there is clean and there is unclean. To go from unclean to clean, you need to be cleansed, to be purified. To go from clean to sacred, you need to be set apart through blood. So we can think about this space over here as tabernacle space. The common space is thought of as outside the tabernacle. So the camp, the wilderness, the camp of Israel, and the wilderness. Unclean can become clean, can become unclean, clean can become holy or set apart for the Lord, which is what the Day of Atonement solves for the entire people, makes them holy. But here's the thing. Holy and unclean can never come in contact. Very dangerous. Even though it's not a sin problem per se, sometimes it is. Sometimes there's moral uncleanness. When it's just ritual uncleanness, these things cannot come in contact because then things like Nadab and Abihu happen. Death. It's dangerous to be in God's holy space. So that's why there's always this pattern of first they become cleansed and restored to the camp. Then once they are cleaned, then they go to the sanctuary at the tabernacle and they make their offering gift. So that is the logic of clean and unclean, is that it's out in the common space. It seems to be the correlation between clean and unclean is actually a correlation between life and death in all examples in chapters 11 through 15. That seems to be what's going on. So to move from sacred space, you might see the word profane. To profane something is to make something that is sacred common. So to profane means to go from sacred to common clean. But then you can also pollute something, which means to go from clean to unclean. So profane, pollute. Progression out from the sanctuary. The other way, though, first you cleanse, you go from unclean to clean, cleanse, and then you sanctify, or you make holy, you set apart. So these phrases of sacred, common, clean, unclean, holy, impure, as we'll see in later chapters. They're all functioning in the sphere of space. These are spatial ideas that are written down onto words on paper. So if you had a study Bible, maybe it even has a little map that is sometimes helpful, but I will draw one for us. Okay, if you want to draw and follow along, you can do that. We're going to draw the tabernacle from an aerial view. First, we're going to draw a square. Bad square, but a square nonetheless. That is the Holy of Holies, the center of the tabernacle. We're just going to go H and H. Holy of Holies. That's where the Ark of the Covenant is. That's where God's personal presence dwells in the midst of his people. And then we're going to do a rectangle around that. This is the holy place, or also called the tent of meeting. Tent of meeting. This is where the showbread is, and this is where the menorah is inside of here, and also where the altar for the scent, the incense altar is in here. And right here is a door. Yeah. The curtains goes here. There's also curtains here. And then outside of this, I'm just going to choose a different color for our drawing. Outside of this is the altar. And then the tabernacle, we're just going to do one more rectangle. That is the tabernacle. So a threefold division. Outside of the tabernacle is the camp. So all this is going to be the camp, where the people encamp around the tabernacle. And when we get to the book of Numbers, we'll actually see that they organize their camp to where the tabernacle is in the uttermost center. But then outside of the camp would just be the wilderness. Okay. I'm going to erase these things just so it looks cleaner. One more detail I want to highlight for us. Directionally, this is east and this is west. So what direction are you going if you're leaving the tabernacle? East. Oh, remember reading Genesis and they were exiled from the garden to the east? And then Cain goes east. They kept going east into their exile. East is the direction of exile. And ultimately, what's east of Israel? Babylon, where they get exiled to. It's also where the sun rises, so it's facing the rising of the sun. But west is the direction of redemption, re-entering the place of God. So, spatially, out in the east, in the wilderness, unclean, clean, sanctified. Yeah? So that's why when we read some of the unclean, clean laws, sometimes when you're unclean, you go outside of the camp. Because it's a visible and physical experience to understand these realities, these theological realities of unclean, clean, and holy. So it's like the nation of Israel is living out this drama through their spatial situations. Oh, I'm unclean, so I'm going to go out of the camp. I'm now clean. I'm going to go back into the camp. I'm going to head in that direction because all of this, even though chapters 11 through 15 deal with ritual uncleanness, which is not a matter of sin, uncleanness in the large scale, being connected to death, is a result of sin. It's because we live under the curse of sin in a fallen world. The reason why our bodies decay, the reason why we get sick, is because of sin, ultimately. Not because of our sin, not because of another sin against us, because of our ancestors Adam and Eve's sin. But that is the reality that we live in. So it's a reminder that there needs to be some sort of redemption, some sort of restoration that takes place. Saw your hand pop up? What about what?
The Peter had vision.
Oh, yes. Yep. It's a great question. Yeah, what is up with that? Just wait till we get to the book of Acts. It's so good. But something has taken place after, in that point of the story, that hadn't happened yet. This new covenant, and mainly an atonement sacrifice. And atonements are cleansing. So there's a cleansing that takes place in the atonement of Christ over creation. Questions? Comments? Yeah.
So do we have any ritual uncleanness now?
Ooh. That's a good question. That is a good question.
Because we don't talk about it at all.
Yeah.
We talk about it only from a sin perspective.
Do we have uncleanness now? That's a great question, Kathleen. I'm going to ponder that one a lot. But here is one thought. Here's one thought that comes to mind in Ephesians chapter 5, the husbands and wife passage. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Here's what Christ did. That he might sanctify her, having cleansed her. Having already cleansed her, he sanctifies the church by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor without spot or wrinkle. So spot, like an offering. So here's what the logic of verse 26 is. What Christ did by giving himself up as a sacrifice, he did it for the church so that he might sanctify the church, having already cleansed her by the washing of water. Or how we just